Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a guinea pig in acrylics. Now this video is really going to focus on how to paint realistic fur. The way that the fur was on this guinea pig, it really does ruffle up and change direction in many different ways. So in order to make sure that we capture that realistically, the brush technique is really important. But before I focus on the fur aspect of any painting, I will always map in the eye first. Now I'll get this done completed so that I know I've captured the expression and emotion of that animal before I work on the fur. Now once I do work on the fur, this is where I start to break the painting up into really small chunks, so 1 or 2 square inches at a time in some cases. So once I've broken up this one area, I'm only focusing on the fur around the eye. I can now start to refine my layers. Now the layering process is something that I talk about in all tutorials here on YouTube and my in-depth tutorials on Patreon. Without the layers here, we're not going to be able to build up the realistic fur texture. The depth's going to be very limited and everything is going to just appear more of a flatter two-dimensional feel. So you can see here that I'm using a range of brushes to achieve that depth and texture. The other thing here is you'll see that I'm adjusting my colour in stages with additional layers such as glazes. Now I've got a video here on YouTube and it talks about glazes using various different paintings and the scenarios that I like to use those glazes depending on the effect that I'm going for. So if that's of interest, I'll link that video in the description below. Now as you can see here, this fur is looking a little bit pale. It doesn't really have the vibrancy that I'm going for in my finished painting that you can see in the corner. But all of that is adjusted in stages. By working with glazes like this, I don't have to focus on mixing the exact colour at each layer. I can focus on my values, so you can see that I'm building up my lighter highlights, I'm adjusting that colour, and then I'll go in with another layer of highlights. This is my preference with any painting, and it's why Liquitex Basics is one of my favourite ultimate brands of paint to use. Now I have tried other brands of paint, but I always go back to the Liquitex Basics because it works so well for these techniques. Working with glazes, it takes out all of that stress of having to worry about that colour selection process. It's just something that we really do not have to focus on. Now mixing the exact colour is something that I'm asked very frequently on social media and here on YouTube. Now mixing the exact colour, it doesn't have to be as stressful as what we may initially think. When we start focusing on the value, so how light or how dark that colour should be, the actual colour that we need to mix becomes easier. Now this is something that's far more simpler to break down in the real-time versions on Patreon. So if you would like to see this tutorial with a voiceover while I'm painting, so there are no sections sped up or cut out, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. Now the wonderful thing with acrylics is because it is such a versatile medium, you can approach a painting in many different ways. So if you are an artist who likes to paint the exact colour for each layer, then of course that's absolutely fine to do so. But if colour selection and mixing your colours is something that you do find more stressful and challenging, then working in glazes like this, and especially the smaller areas and then individual layers, can be really beneficial. Now moving on to brush technique, and this is where I wanted this video on YouTube to focus on. Now this one area on the face is a prime example. Look at how I'm adjusting my brush strokes, so I'm changing the fur direction, the length of my brush strokes, and also the thickness of my brush strokes. Now these 3 things are something that I talk about in one of my videos here on YouTube. It's my top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics. If that's of interest, I'll also link that in the description below. But the main things that are happening here is look at how all of my brush strokes are curved. There are no straight lines at all. Now this is going to make a real difference to how realistic the fur is going to look when finished. The other thing is they're not individual brush strokes, they are all grouped together to some degree. Now of course this is going to vary depending on the fur texture that we are painting, but for something like this we do want to be making sure that we are adjusting the brush in a way that we can replicate that in our photo. So regardless if it's wiry fur or soft out of focus fur, the way that we are moving and using that brush is ultimately going to really vary to what our painting's going to look like. So here is a prime example with this larger white section of the fur. I'm using my brush technique to still focus on getting the fur direction accurate. This is something that I do always emphasize even at this base layer stage. Now although we can paint over it and very easily correct any mistakes, The reason I like to replicate the fur direction for my base layer is because I'm already then training my brain to view that reference photo for the details right from that very first layer. Now the other thing that you can see here is I've obviously turned my painting round. This makes it easier to move that brush in a way that we're going to then capture those realistic brush and fur techniques. So here, when I get my longer details, I want to be making sure that that brush is in contact with that surface for a longer amount of time. It might only be a split second, but it's going to be longer than that, for instance, for the fur on the face. This is what's going to give us that natural, realistic variety, which is so important when painting fur. Now, one thing that I've briefly mentioned in this video is the layering process and how important it is to build up those layers. Now, as you can see here, I am working with many layers, and quite often it's all about those layers of subtlety. So when you work with your base layers, I usually do like to work from dark to light when working with acrylics, but you don't want to just put in your base layer and then jump to your lightest highlights, because that is what's going to make the fur look flat and two-dimensional. So with all of my in-depth tutorials on Patreon, I really do emphasize this as well as everything else, because the layering process is one of the main things that's going to make that fur and therefore the painting look three-dimensional. Now with layers, it's important to really look at that reference photo and notice what you should be painting first, so the order of those layers can make a real difference. I'm, for instance, now working on this top part of the head because some of the hairs are going to be overlapping the top part of the forehead, but also some of those hairs are then going to be overlapping the ear. So what I'm having to do now is take a break, work on the ear, and then I can come back and work on the white fur and add those tiny lighter hairs over the top. Now, if I'd have painted those lighter hairs now before I'd have worked on the ear, I then have to paint around those details when I do come to paint the ear later on. And that's of course far more fiddly, and it just takes so much longer. So when I've got a reference photo with fur like this where it does change direction quickly or overlap other elements very easily, I like to look at that photo and paint what's behind it first. I find that therefore it makes the entire painting process much easier. Now earlier in the video I mentioned about how I break everything up into small chunks, and now I'm at this stage of the painting, you can really see why that can be motivational. If I decided to end the painting session here, it already looks like a photograph, so I'm far more motivated now to pick up my brushes the following day and get straight back to it. So working in smaller chunks not only makes the painting process easier, for me personally, obviously every artist is unique in the way they like to work, but I don't ever get stressed because I'm breaking it up into small chunks. And it also, as I've said, it keeps me wanting to get back to that painting because I'm never leaving it at that ugliest stage. If I'd have worked with all of the base layer and then my layer of refinement or my detailed layers on top, and you end up with a stage that doesn't look overly nice, it can be very hard to want to pick up those brushes and carry on. So because I never leave my painting looking like that, it already ends up looking like that photo before I call it a day. I'm all now ready to then get straight back to it, and therefore I'm never at that burnout stage. Now, artist burnout is something that I've recently covered in a video that I've uploaded to Patreon. Now, you don't have to be a member to watch that video, so you are more than welcome to head over to Patreon now and scroll down to that. I'll pop a link to my Patreon in the description below. But in that video, I mention about the ways that I like to cope when I feel more overwhelmed with any other stresses that are going on. Now, the way that everything happens, it might not be art that's making us stressed, but sometimes being stressed can make us overthink the painting process. So when I feel like that, I do have a couple of coping mechanisms that I use to prevent myself from feeling burnt out, because sometimes that can make us not create or be at the easel at all, which is obviously a real shame. Now, one of those things that I've mentioned in this video on Patreon is how when you set a goal, sit at your easel and say to yourself, I'm only going to work on, for instance, the face. That's my main aim for this painting session. If you then achieve more during that session because you feel like you've got in the zone and you want to carry on, then that's great. That's a real boost because we've actually achieved more than we initially set out to do. But if you sit down to your easel and think, right, I need to get all of the guinea pig painted, we are setting ourselves up to fail. So it's an unrealistic goal. So whenever we've got any of those times where we are feeling more stressed for whatever the reason may be, breaking it up into small chunks and setting realistic goals is one of the best ways I've found to overcome that. Now, as I've said, if you would like to watch that video with the tips that I mentioned there and how I personally manage this, then that is all linked in the description. Now onto the body of this guinea pig and back to the fur technique. This is where, one of the main reasons I chose the reference photo for this. So the fur on the body was so interesting to paint. How it swirls, the curves, the shapes that it creates, it was really fascinating to replicate in this painting. Now one thing here, I've just mentioned how I work on smaller sections, and that's absolutely true. But this section, I've worked on the entire middle section of this body in one go. The reason for that is this fur was longer, and the way that it curved, it did overlap areas next to that other section that I was working on. So to make sure that I got that fluid feeling of this fur, because it's very unique for this animal, I felt that to best replicate that, I needed to work in a larger section. So like with anything with art, there really are no rules at all. So just go with what you feel comfortable with at the time. So now here, that was a perfect example of a glaze. I've adjusted my first layer with the use of a lovely burnt sienna, raw sienna glaze. And now I can go back in and add another layer of details. Now the brushes that I'm using here are a mixture, primarily my liner or rigger brushes. And with that, the brush technique and the consistency of your paint are very important. Now the pressure of that brush I've already mentioned, but the consistency of the paint is also what's going to affect how well this brush works. So if you've got too much paint in your mixture and it's too thick, you won't be able to create those longer brush strokes. You'll end up with start and stop points, which can be very frustrating. That therefore tells you that you just need to add a little bit more water to your mixture. If, however, you're using the brush and your brush details almost look like they are sort of beading up, or they look like transparent ridges, that there says that you've got too much water in your mixture and you need to add a little bit more paint. Now the more you use a liner or rigger brush, the easier it is to judge the consistency of the paint, but very rarely do we get it right first time. There are so many times throughout the painting process where I'll go to create a brush stroke and I'll go, nope, that needs more paint, or no, that's too thick, I need to add more water. But definitely the more you use a liner brush, the easier that does get to judge. Now again, the brush technique, how to get the consistency of the paint, is something that I do cover in the real-time version on Patreon. Now the very last thing really for this background is the grass. Now I didn't paint the grass at the time of working on the background because I did want this to be in front of that background. So again, going back to what I've mentioned with my layers, I'm always paying attention to what's in front or behind. Now because I was going to have some of those blades of grass overlapping the feet, I then had to make sure that the feet were painted next before I could finish the grass. Now in terms of the background, all of that is also available on the real-time version on Patreon. So I'm showing there how to get a really smooth, well-blended background, which is a very similar effect to working with oils, all through the use of a fine mist sprayer bottle and the right layering process and blending techniques. So if you would like to see how to blend acrylics to get this soft outer focus effect, then the real-time version on Patreon would be useful. Now when it comes to painting feet of any animal, a person, hands, anything like that, focus on the shapes. So at the moment this foot looks pretty scary. It has to just focus on the main highlights and shadows. Now the other thing is with this, for this situation, for this painting, I didn't really have to get the claws finished because the grass was going to be overlapping those. So as long as I made sure that the highlights and the shadows were accurate for the top surfaces of the feet, then that was my main priority, because I did know that I was going to be painting over so much of the lower section of the toes. Now if this was a solid surface and it was just a shadow that was going to be under the guinea pig, then obviously the feet are going to have to be given a little bit more time and consideration. But when I knew that I was overlapping grass here, that really wasn't having to take main priority. Now when it comes to painting the grass, just like the fur, look at how I'm layering up in stages. I'm not working with one colour, I'm always making sure to adjust my values. And like with any painting where I am painting whiskers, they get left to the very last element. They are overlapping everything else. So if I were to paint the whiskers early and then I needed to make changes to the fur behind it, I'm going to have to paint around those whiskers, and that takes so much longer. So it's now at this stage when I knew I was happy with the guinea pig that I could then add these in. Now, I can't stress enough, I don't normally turn my paintings around as often as I am for this project, but given how everything was curved so quickly here, I did feel that was giving me the best technique with that brush. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. Here's a finished photo of my painting, and if you've got any art related questions, anything that I've covered in this tutorial, then as always feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I also upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I do also have a list of all tutorials that are available on my Patreon, and that is linked in the description below. There is a wide variety of wildlife subjects and domestic pets. I do like to tailor some of my content here to the pet portrait side of things, so that any of my Patreon members who would like to take on pet portrait commissions of their own has a wide variety of domestic pets that they can then transfer the tips and techniques I share into their own work. So I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but if you do have any suggestions or any specific requests for animals that you would like to see featured in projects, then let me know in the comments below, because I can get those added to my list. As always, thank you so much for watching.